The Thames had frozen solid by the second week of February, and the fair that sprang from it spread across the ice like a second city, loud with fiddles, thick with the smell of roasting chestnuts and hot gin, and crowded with every rank of London pressed together in a way the drawing-rooms of Mayfair would never have permitted. Eleanor Fenwick stood at the river's edge in a pair of leather gloves that did not fit her. They had been her father's, brown and cracked at the thumb, the fingers curling past her own by a full joint. And she wore them because she had no winter gloves of her own, and because the cold that morning had been sharp enough to split wood. She had come to find her brother. Thomas had sent word that he would be skating near the printing press they had set up on the ice below Blackfriars Bridge, and that she should come, that the spectacle was not to be missed. She found him at the center of the frozen river, moving in wide arcs with a man she did not recognize. The stranger was tall, dark-haired. He skated with a grim mechanical precision that had nothing of Thomas's loose-limbed ease, his jaw set as though the act of moving across ice cost him something he had decided to pay. His coat was dark and very fine, and he did not smile. Not once, in the full minute Eleanor stood watching before Thomas caught sight of her and waved. The stranger slowed. His blades carved a shallow arc in the ice, and he stood still for a moment, breathing, his hands loose at his sides, and Eleanor saw something cross his face that she could not name. A settling. As though the worst part of whatever he had been doing was over, and he had survived it. Near the chestnut stall, two women in furs observed the same scene. The elder, gray-haired beneath a hat trimmed with silver fox, inclined her head toward her companion and said, without lowering her voice, "That is Thomas Fenwick's spare relation, the one with no portion to speak of." The companion murmured something Eleanor did not catch. "She manages his house," the elder woman continued, adjusting the silver fox with one gloved hand, "which is a polite way of saying she has nowhere else to go." Eleanor did not turn. She kept her eyes on the ice, and her father's gloves pressed together at her waist, the leather stiff against her knuckles, and she waited for Thomas to reach her. He arrived breathless, red-cheeked, hauling the dark-haired man by the sleeve. "Eleanor, you came. Excellent. This is Lord Hale, the Marquis of Hale, my very old friend from Cambridge, who has at last been persuaded that ice will hold a man's weight. Hale, my sister Eleanor." Lord Hale looked at her. His gaze was level, unhurried, and it settled on her face for a beat longer than politeness required, before dropping, briefly, to her hands, to the gloves, the cracked leather, and the fingers that curled past her own. "Miss Fenwick," he said. His voice was low and very even. "My lord." She drew her hands behind her back. Thomas, oblivious, was already turning toward the gin stall, calling over his shoulder about a printer who had set type directly on the frozen river and was selling souvenir cards for a shilling. Eleanor moved to follow him, and her boot caught a ridge of rough ice where the crowd had worn a path down to gray slush. She stumbled forward. Lord Hale's hand closed around her elbow before she had finished falling, firm and immediate, and when she steadied herself and looked up, his face was very close and very still. "The ice is uneven here," he said. "Walk on the right, where it has been swept." He released her arm and stepped back. His hand returned to his side, and the fingers closed once, briefly, as though registering the absence of what they had held. The place where his grip had pressed her sleeve held warmth for a long time afterward, longer than the February air should have allowed. If you have ever stood at the edge of a frozen river and watched someone move across it with the kind of care that looks, from a distance, like confidence, you will know the particular silence that settles when the surface holds. Stay close. This story is about a surface that held. Thomas Fenwick had inherited Fenwick Hall, and its 300 acres in Hertfordshire when their father died of a fever in the autumn of 1812. He had also inherited the debts, the leaking roof, the tenant disputes, and the comfortable assumption that Eleanor would remain in the house to manage all of it. She had been 21 then. She was 23 now. Her portion was £200 per annum, settled in their father's will and paid quarterly from the estate's income, which Thomas controlled. It was enough to keep her in plain gowns and mended stockings, and the annual subscription to the circulating library that was her single extravagance. It was not enough to keep her anywhere independently, and the arithmetic of her position, which she had calculated many times on the backs of Thomas's household receipts, always arrived at the same conclusion. She could not leave without a husband, and the season had made it very clear that a husband was not forthcoming. Thomas had brought her to London in January with the cheerful conviction that she would find a match if only she were seen in the right rooms. He did not seem to understand that the right rooms had already looked at her and decided she was not worth the trouble of seeing. She was not plain. She was not beautiful. She was the kind of woman whose face the season's machinery could not categorize and therefore could not sell, and the machinery, finding no use for her, had set her aside with the same efficiency it applied to wallflowers and second daughters and women past 22 with small portions and no connections worth cultivating. She rose each morning at 7 in the rented house on Wimpole Street and opened the shutters to let in whatever grey London light the day provided. She dressed herself because they had not brought a lady's maid. She wrote out the day's menus, checked the coal stores, mended what needed mending, and ensured that Thomas's shirts were pressed and his boots cleaned by the time he descended the stairs at 11. She kept his accounts in a small leather-bound ledger she had purchased with her own money, and she balanced them weekly, because Thomas did not balance anything. She had written to 3 agencies about a position as a governess, and she had told no one, and the letters sat unanswered in the drawer of her writing desk beside a miniature portrait of her father that she kept face down because looking at it cost more than she could afford on a weekday morning. She wore her father's gloves because Thomas had not thought to buy her new ones, and she did not ask because asking would have required her to name her dependency aloud, and she had decided, quietly and completely, that she would not. The gloves sat on her bureau each night, too large and faintly creased with her father's grip, the left thumb cracked almost through. She did not wear them for warmth alone. She wore them because they were the last thing his hands had touched that still fit around hers, even badly, and because in a house that was no longer hers and a season that did not want her, they were the only inheritance she could carry without asking permission. Lord Hale appeared again 3 days after the Frost Fair at a dinner hosted by Sir Edwin Langton and his wife in their house on Half Moon Street. Eleanor had not expected to see him. Thomas had mentioned that Hale was his oldest friend from Cambridge and that Hale kept largely to himself, preferred his estate in Wiltshire to the London season, and had come to town only because a matter of business with his solicitor required his presence. She had filed the information away without weight, another detail about a man she would never know well enough to matter. She was seated near the foot of the table, between a deaf clergyman who smiled benevolently at everything, and a young lieutenant who spoke only of his regiment's forthcoming posting to the peninsula. The center of the table belonged to Miss Arabella Langton, who was 20, golden-haired, and possessed of the particular confidence that came from having been told since birth that she was the correct choice for a man of rank. Her gown was ivory silk. Her pearls were real. She sat beside Lord Hale with the settled ease of a woman who had already been measured for the role of Marchioness and found to fit. Lord Hale was seated to Arabella's right, and he occupied his chair the way he had occupied the ice, with a precision that gave nothing away. Eleanor watched him from her end of the table the way one watches weather through a window. He spoke little. He answered Arabella's questions with the same level courtesy he would have offered a shopkeeper. his face civil and closed. And when Arabella laughed, bright and practiced, his expression did not change. Twice he looked down the length of the table toward Eleanor. The first time, she met his eyes and looked away immediately, as though she had been caught reaching for something that was not hers. The second time, she did not look away quickly enough, and something in his face shifted. A fractional easing around the jaw, a slight drop of the shoulders, as if a held breath had been released through the bone. The footman set the soup tureen at the center of the table and withdrew. Eleanor reached for the ladle, which had been placed too far from her seat, and her chair scraped against the floor with a sound that made the deaf clergyman blink. Lord Hale, 6 seats away, said, "Allow me," and rose from his place. He walked the length of the table, moved the tureen 6 inches toward her, and returned to his seat without looking at anyone. The room continued as though nothing had happened. Arabella's smile held its position. The lieutenant resumed his account of supply routes through Portugal. Eleanor's hands, hidden beneath the tablecloth, were trembling, not from cold. That night, in the small bedroom Thomas's rented house afforded her, she sat on the edge of the narrow bed with her father's gloves in her lap and pressed her thumb into the cracked leather where his thumb had worn a groove. The warmth at her elbow had long since faded. She told herself it had been courtesy, the automatic gesture of a well-bred man toward any woman struggling with a heavy tureen at an awkward reach. She told herself this twice, once aloud, and the room absorbed the words without confirming them. Her pulse, stubborn and slow, did not agree. Mrs. Baxter arrived in London on the 15th of February, wrapped in 3 shawls and smelling of the camphor she packed in her traveling case to keep the moths from her woolens. She had been the housekeeper at Fenwick Hall for 30 years, since before Eleanor was born, since before Eleanor's mother had died, bringing her into the world. And she had come to the city for the winter because the cold in Hertfordshire had settled into her joints with a permanence the local surgeon could not reverse, and because Eleanor had written to say there was a small room off the kitchen where she could be comfortable. Mrs. Baxter's eyes were failing. She could see shapes and light, the outline of a doorway, the pale square of a window, the difference between a candle and a fire. She could not see faces. She could not see print. Eleanor read to her each morning in the drawing room, sitting close enough that Mrs. Baxter could hear the pages turn and know where they were in the text. On the morning of the 17th, Eleanor was reading from a volume of Cowper's letters, the passage about the tame hares, which Mrs. Baxter had loved since Eleanor first read it to her 10 years ago. She had reached the part where Cowper describes the particular gentleness required to hold a creature that trusts you when she became aware that someone was standing in the doorway behind her. She did not turn. She finished the passage, read it again more slowly when Mrs. Baxter asked her to repeat the part about the garden, and adjusted the angle of the book so the light from the window fell more evenly across the page, though Mrs. Baxter could no longer see the difference. Lord Hale stood in the doorway for a full minute before he moved. He had come early for a meeting with Thomas, who was still dressing, as Thomas was always still dressing, and the footman had shown him to the drawing room without announcing him. He said nothing. He watched Eleanor's hands turn the pages with the steady rhythm of someone who had done this many times, watched her lean forward to repeat a phrase Mrs. Baxter had missed, watched her tuck the shawl more tightly around the old woman's shoulders without interrupting the sentence she was reading, watched the particular care with which she handled the book, as though the words inside it were a debt she owed to someone who could no longer collect. When Thomas appeared at the top of the stairs and called down a cheerful greeting, Hale turned away from the doorway as though the act of looking had cost him something he had not meant to spend. His hand went briefly to his waistcoat pocket, pressed there for a moment against something small and hard, and then dropped to his side. That evening, At a card party in Mrs. Rowland's drawing room, the fire burned high and the conversation turned, as it always did, to the season's prospects. Arabella Langton stood near the mantel in blue muslin, a sapphire brooch at her collar, and spoke with the easy authority of a woman who had never doubted her place in any room she entered. The talk was of Lord Hale, of his long absence from London, of the general expectation that he would announce his intentions before Easter, and of the suitability of a match between the Langton fortune and the Ashworth title. Someone mentioned Eleanor. Someone else murmured something about her plain gown. Arabella turned her head, and her gaze found Eleanor at the card table with the precision of a woman accustomed to knowing exactly where her competition sat and how little it weighed. "The spare Fenwick girl," Arabella said, her voice calibrated to carry to the edges of the room. "She reads to servants. One would think she was one herself." A ripple of laughter moved through the women nearest her. The sound was not cruel in the way a slap is cruel. It was cruel in the way weather is cruel, impersonal and complete. And it passed through Eleanor's body the way cold passes through a thin gown. She set down her hand and studied her cards, as though the arrangement of hearts and spades required her complete attention. Her face was still. Her breathing was even. Beneath the table, her father's gloves, folded in her lap, pressed against her knees with the weight of something she would not name. The walks began the following week. Lord Hale arrived at Thomas's house each morning at 10, with the punctuality of a man who keeps military hours, and Thomas, who rose at 11 and regarded punctuality as a suggestion rather than a practice, was never ready. Hale waited in the hall, standing beside the hat rack with his hands clasped behind his back, and his gaze fixed on the frost patterns on the hall window. Eleanor, who had been awake since 7 and had already balanced the household accounts and written 3 letters and argued with the cook about the price of mutton, would appear with her coat and her father's gloves and say, "Thomas will be another quarter of an hour. Shall we walk?" They walked. Through the park, along the Serpentine where the ice had thinned to a gray skin that held no weight, past the skeleton trees and the frost-hardened paths where nursemaids pushed perambulators and old men scattered bread for the ducks. He walked with his hands clasped behind his back and his gaze fixed ahead, and he asked her questions she had not been asked before. Not the season's questions, not the drawing-room inventory of accomplishments and connections and annual income and eligible relations. He asked her what she read. He asked her how she managed a household of 9 on Thomas's budget. And when she answered precisely, naming the economies, he listened with the focused attention of a man who understood that competence was not a lesser virtue. He asked her once whether she missed Hertfordshire, and when she said she missed the kitchen garden and the sound of the rooks in the elms behind the church, and the particular quality of silence in the house at 5 in the morning before anyone else was awake. He was quiet for a long time, and his jaw moved once, fractionally, in a way she had come to recognize as the closest his face came to expression. On the third walk, he stopped at the edge of the Serpentine and said, without turning, "You are cold. We should go back." "I am not cold, my lord." "Your hands." He glanced down. The leather gloves were stiff with frost, the cracked thumb gaping open. "Those gloves are not sufficient." "They are what I have." He looked at her then, the full, steady weight of his gaze, and in it something she had not seen before, not the curiosity of the dinner table or the measuring attention of the drawing room, something closer to recognition, as though he had just understood something about her that she had been saying with every mended hem and balanced ledger and morning walk in a dead man's gloves, and he had finally heard it. "Come inside," he said, and he turned toward the gate without waiting for her answer. and she followed. Because the command in his voice was not dominance. It was the particular authority of a man who had decided that her comfort was his concern, and would not accept her refusal of it. It was on the fourth walk that Eleanor noticed what had been absent from every conversation. He never mentioned skating. He never suggested they return to the frozen river, though the ice still held, and the fair had not yet ended. Thomas, careless as ever, had said over breakfast the morning before, "Philip has not been on the ice in 14 years, you know. Not since Cecily. I practically had to drag him to the Frost Fair. He did it for me, which is more than I deserved of him." Eleanor set down her cup. Cecily? His sister. She was 12. Fell through the ice on the lake at Ashworth Park in the winter of 1800. Philip was 16. He was supposed to be watching her. Thomas reached for the toast rack with the casual hand of a man who had never lost anyone to ice. Dreadful business. He blamed himself, of course. One does. He carried her off the lake himself, they said. She was already gone. Eleanor looked at the doorway where Hale had stood 3 mornings before, watching her read to Mrs. Baxter, his hand pressed against his waistcoat pocket, where something small and hard lived. She understood now. The grim precision on the ice. The set of his jaw. The cost of the act, visible in every line of his body. The rigid discipline of a man doing a thing that had nearly destroyed him because a friend had asked, and he could not say no without naming the reason. He had skated with Thomas because Thomas had asked. And Thomas was the kind of man who asked without understanding what the asking required. And while Lord Hale had been paying that cost, moving across the frozen surface of the river with the ghost of a 12-year-old girl at the margin of his vision, Eleanor had been standing at the edge in a dead man's gloves, watching him, 2 people wearing what the dead had left them. She did not say this aloud. She pressed her thumb into the groove in her father's glove and said nothing at all. If this story has found you on a cold evening, and if you are the kind of person who recognizes the particular bravery of returning to a thing that nearly destroyed you, you might stay a little longer. There is a moment coming that will be worth the wait. Lady Cavendish hosted a dinner on the 1st of March in her house on Berkeley Square, a house of white stone and tall windows that announced its consequence to the street, with the same quiet certainty its owner announced hers to the room. The invitation had included Thomas, and Thomas had insisted on bringing Eleanor, and Lady Cavendish had permitted it with the particular graciousness that costs nothing and communicates everything. Eleanor was seated at the farthest end of the table, between a young widow who spoke only of her late husband's debts and a magistrate who ate with mechanical determination and did not look up. Arabella was seated to Lord Hale's right, in ivory silk and her mother's diamonds, and she shone the way expensive things shine in candlelight, bright and impersonal and decorative. Lady Cavendish presided from the head of the table, silver-haired, composed, her posture an argument that the world was arranged correctly and needed only minor maintenance to remain so. The room was warm, heavy with the scent of hothouse flowers that had no business blooming in March. Eleanor ate little. She listened to the widow's inventory of unpaid bills and offered what she could. The name of a solicitor Thomas had used for the estate debts, a suggestion about the quarterly rents, a steadying hand on the woman's wrist when her voice cracked over the figure her husband had owed the wine merchant alone. The widow gripped Eleanor's fingers and held them, briefly, beneath the tablecloth. At the center of the table, Arabella was telling a story about a hunt ball in Surrey, and the laughter that followed was bright and assured and excluded Eleanor as completely as a closed door. Lady Cavendish raised her glass. The room quieted. "I do not wish to be premature," she said, smiling with the measured warmth of a woman who was never premature, because she never acted without certainty. and I know my son will forgive a mother's eagerness. I believe we may expect a happy announcement before the season is out. Miss Langton has been a friend to this family for many years, and I have every confidence that friendship will deepen into something more permanent." The room murmured its approval. Glasses were lifted. Arabella lowered her eyes with practiced modesty. Lord Hale's face did not move. Eleanor watched his hand close around the stem of his glass and remain there, unraised, while every other hand in the room lifted toward Arabella. His jaw was set the way it had been set on the ice, the same grim line, the same visible cost of remaining still when everything in him wanted to move. Eleanor excused herself before the port was served. In the corridor, drawing on her father's gloves with fingers that would not steady, she heard Lady Cavendish's voice from the small parlor where the women had withdrawn for tea. "Thomas Fenwick's spare relation is still lingering, I see. I cannot imagine what he was thinking. Bringing her. She has neither face nor fortune to recommend her, and frankly the girl has become a mild embarrassment. Someone should tell her brother to send her home before the season decides. She is more pitiable than she is invisible." Mrs. Whitfield, the companion from the Frost Fair, murmured agreement. Eleanor's hands stopped moving. The left glove was half on, the leather bunched at her knuckles, and she stood in the corridor of a house that would never welcome her with a dead man's glove caught between her fingers and Lady Cavendish's unhurried, confident assessment settling into the walls around her like damp. She finished pulling on the glove. She walked the 2 miles back to Thomas's house in the dark, past the shuttered shops and the lamplit squares, and when she arrived, her boots damp and her cheeks raw from the cold, she sat at the writing desk in her small bedroom and composed a letter to Mrs. Baxter's niece in Hertfordshire, asking whether the cottage would be ready for their return by the following week. She packed her trunk that night. She folded her father's gloves on top of her 2 gowns, the plain muslin and the mended one, and she closed the lid. She told Thomas the next morning that she would leave London by the end of the week. "Leave?" Thomas looked up from his eggs, his face blank with the particular confusion of a man who has never had to leave anywhere he did not wish to leave. "The season is barely started." "The season does not want me, Thomas. I would rather be useful at home than ornamental here." Thomas opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. And in the brief silence, Eleanor saw what she had always known, that he loved her and did not understand her, and that the distance between those 2 things was the exact shape of her loneliness. Worth is not loud. It does not announce itself at dinner tables or raise its glass to its own reflection. It reads aloud to a woman who cannot see, and it walks home alone in the dark, and it folds a dead man's gloves on the bureau with the care of someone who knows that the last things we carry are the last things we lose. The gathering was Lady Cavendish's idea. A final evening in her drawing room on Berkeley Square before the season's formal calendar began its relentless machinery, intimate enough to control and public enough to count. She had invited 30 guests, including the Rowlands, the Langtons, Mrs. Whitfield, the Palmers, and every family whose opinion settled the season's quiet, brutal ledger. She had, at Thomas's insistence, included Eleanor. Thomas had promised his sister one last evening before her departure, and Lady Cavendish had permitted it the way one permits a child an extra biscuit, indulgently and without consequence. Eleanor wore her best gown, which was not very good. Pale muslin, twice mended at the hem, the fabric washed so many times it had gone soft as skin. With a sash she had re-dyed herself from a bolt end purchased at a draper's on Cheapside. She wore her father's gloves to the door and removed them in the hall, folding them into a reticule because there was no servant she trusted to hold them. She entered the drawing room behind Thomas and took a seat near the window, where the curtain offered a partial screen from the room, and the cold glass behind her kept her breathing steady. Arabella stood near the fireplace in white silk. diamonds at her throat, her hand resting on the mantelpiece with the confidence of a woman who expected to own it by summer. Lady Cavendish moved among her guests with the measured grace of a hostess who had arranged the evening's outcome in advance and was merely waiting for the players to find their marks. Mrs. Baxter was there as well, seated in the corner where Eleanor had placed her earlier that afternoon, so she could hear the music if the musicians played. The old woman's hands rested on the arms of her chair, and her face was turned toward the room with the patient attention of someone who has learned to listen for what she can no longer see. The room was everything Eleanor was not. Bright and assured and expensive. And Eleanor sat inside it the way a stone sits at the bottom of a clear stream. Present and unseen and perfectly still. Lord Hale arrived late. He entered the drawing room alone, and the quality of his silence changed the room's air, the way a drop temperature changes the weight of snow. He did not go to Arabella. He did not go to his mother. He stood in the doorway for a moment, and his gaze moved across the room with the same unhurried precision Eleanor had seen on the ice at the Frost Fair, the deliberate scanning of a man who was looking for one specific thing and would not move until he had found it. He found her. He crossed the room. 3 strides. The carpet absorbed the sound of his boots, and the conversation nearest the fireplace died mid-sentence as the guests registered the direction of his movement, the straight line of it, the way it passed Arabella without pausing, the way it passed his mother without acknowledgement. Arabella's hand left the mantelpiece. Lady Cavendish turned from the Palmers. The musicians lowered their bows. 30 guests held their breath in a room that smelled of hothouse lilies and beeswax, and the particular charged silence that precedes a thing that cannot be taken back. Lord Hale stopped in front of Eleanor's chair. She looked up at him. His face was very close to the face she had seen above her on the ice, the day she had stumbled, the day his hand had closed around her elbow and held. His eyes were the color of smoke, and they were not masked. The room was silent, every glass lowered, every fan stilled. "Miss Fenwick is to be my wife." 6 words. He said them the way he had said, "Walk on the right, where it has been swept," level and low and certain, as though the announcement were a practical instruction, and the only reasonable response was compliance. His voice did not waver. His eyes did not leave her face. Lady Cavendish's hand went to her collarbone. Her lips parted, and the sentence she had prepared, the gracious steering, the polished correction, did not come. Her fingers pressed the pearls at her throat, and for the first time in Eleanor's experience, the composure that had governed every room Lady Cavendish entered was not composure at all. It was the stiff blankness of a woman whose script had failed her in the only room that mattered. She looked at her son, and her son did not look back. He was looking at Eleanor. Arabella took a single step backward. The diamonds at her throat caught the candlelight, and her smile, which had held for 2 more seconds than it should have, broke at the corners like ice giving way at the edge of a river. She turned toward the window and did not turn back. The room, which had spent the entire season looking through Eleanor Fenwick as though she were made of glass, now looked at her as though she were made of something they had not known they needed to see. Thomas, standing by the mantel with a glass of wine he had not yet tasted, set the glass down carefully on the mantelpiece and said, "Well, yes, of course. My consent is given, and gladly." "Eleanor?" Eleanor stood. Her legs were not entirely steady. She looked at Lord Hale, and his face, the stone-carved jaw, the smoke-colored eyes, the mask he had worn since Cambridge, since the ice, since Cecily, was not a mask. It was his face, the one underneath. And it was looking at her as though she were the only solid ground in a room built on a frozen river. "Yes," she said. Mrs. Baxter, in the corner, turned her failing eyes toward the sound of Eleanor's voice and smiled. She could not see the room. She could not see Lord Hale's hand extend, or Eleanor's hand take it, or the way the 30 guests on Lady Cavendish's carefully curated list turned toward the window seat where the spare Fenwick girl had been sitting, invisible for the last hour. She did not need to see. She had heard Eleanor say yes, and the sound of it, quiet and steady and certain, was enough. Lady Cavendish recovered. She drew herself upright, her chin lifting the way it had lifted at the Frost Fair. At every dinner, at every moment when the world had the poor taste to deviate from her arrangement of it. "Philip," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, "this is most irregular." "It is not irregular, Mother. It is decided." He offered Eleanor his hand. She took it. His grip was steady, warm, and calloused across the palm in a way that surprised her, the hands of a man who had done things his title did not require. His thumb settled against her wrist, just above the place where her pulse beat, and he held it there. And the room watched. And the room, for once in its long, expensive season of looking and categorizing and setting aside, saw what it was looking at. 3 weeks later, at Ashworth Park in Wiltshire, the fire had burned low in the small sitting room that Eleanor had already begun to call her own. Snow fell outside the tall windows, steady and silent, the flakes catching the last gray light before the dark settled in. And the parkland beyond was white and still beneath a sky the color of pewter. Mrs. Baxter was asleep in the room down the corridor, the room with the south-facing window and the heavy rug Eleanor had chosen, because its raised pattern could be felt underfoot by a woman who could no longer see where she was walking. A kettle sat on the hob. The house was quiet with the kind of quiet that is not absence and not emptiness, the quiet of a place that has decided to hold the people inside it gently. Eleanor sat in the chair by the fire with a book open in her lap, unread. On the windowsill beside her, folded neatly, sat her father's gloves. The leather was worn almost through at the left thumb, the crack widening now into a split that she had mended once with a needle and brown thread, and would need to mend again before next winter. The fingers still curled past her own by a full joint. She had not needed them for warmth since the night Lord Hale had taken her hand in his mother's drawing room, and had not let go until they reached the carriage. And even then, his release had been slow, his fingers opening one by one, as though letting go of her was a skill he had not yet decided to learn. Philip entered the room without announcement. He had been in the library, attending to correspondence, and he carried with him the faint smell of ink and the particular quality of stillness that meant he had been thinking about something he did not yet know how to say. From his waistcoat pocket, a thin chain hung, and on it, she knew now, was a small oval miniature of a girl with dark hair and her brother's jaw. Cecily. He had carried it every day since Eleanor had known him, and he had never shown it to her, and she had never asked. And the fact that they both understood why was one of the things she loved about him, though she had not said that word aloud yet. And neither had he. He sat in the chair opposite hers. The fire cracked and shifted between them, sending a brief scatter of sparks up the chimney. "You were wearing those gloves," he said, looking at the windowsill, "the day I met you on the ice." "Yes." "They do not fit you." "No. They were my father's." He looked at the gloves on the sill, and she saw something cross his face that she recognized now, the expression of a man who understood what it was to wear what the dead had left you and to keep wearing it because the alternative was to have nothing of them at all. He had worn that expression at the Frost Fair, moving across ice with Cecily's name somewhere behind his teeth. He wore it still, though the shape of it had changed, softer now. The edges smoothed the way water smooths a stone it has carried long enough. I will buy you gloves, he said. Ones that fit. I know you will. You will keep these? Yes. He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. His thumb settled into her palm, and she felt the callus there, the rough, warm line of it. And she thought of the frozen river, the cracked ice, the way he had caught her elbow and steadied her before she had finished falling. She thought of the drawing room on Berkeley Square, the 6 words, the silence afterward that had been so full it could have held the weight of every season that had ever failed to see her. She thought of Mrs. Baxter, asleep down the corridor, and the snow outside the window, and the fire between them, and the house, Philip's house, her house now. Old stone and warm rooms and a kitchen garden she had already planned in her head, with lavender along the south wall and a row of winter cabbages and a bench beneath the oak where Cecily had once sat in summer to watch the deer come down to drink from the stream. Outside, the snow continued. It covered the park, the drive, the stone bench beneath the oak. Eleanor had placed a small wreath of winter holly on the bench that morning, and the snow was covering it now, softly, without hurry, the way certain kinds of forgiveness settle over the places they are most needed. The fire burned. The gloves rested on the sill. Eleanor turned her hand inside his and held on. And the house, old and solid and newly warm, held them both. Thank you for staying until the end. If Eleanor's story found you on a night when you needed to be reminded that quiet worth is eventually, certainly seen, you might leave a word before you go. She would have liked that.